First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the summit for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I enjoy coming to India. It's my third time, first in Bangalore. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly regulatory issues in the United States over the past 30 some years. And I don't mean to tell you that this is for every country and every situation, but to relate some stories and events to you about the U.S. Regulatory system that could be very important. I guess the most important message that I would like to leave with you today is that prices really matter, and getting the prices right can do a lot more than many people think. That's not to say that the government shouldn't plan or the government shouldn't work through issues of the future, but the one thing we know about the future is you're always going to be wrong about it. So let's go with a little bit of background. In electricity, it should be no surprise to anyone that we use a lot of fictions, approximations, paradigm changes in politics, but this isn't unusual. In 300 BC, as we learned last night, Aristotle's science had 5 components: air, water, fire, earth, and something called ether. Ether was used to fill all voids. There was no such thing as a void. You couldn't have space without things in it, according to Aristotle. And because of that, you couldn't have the number 0. In the Middle Ages, the Roman Church adopted Aristotle's science as canon law and punished people for challenging it. The punishments are often very severe. Bruno was burned at the stake for stating his belief in the Copernican model that the Earth revolved around the sun. And because there was no 0, or 0 wasn't allowed, the development of algebra in the Middle Ages was significantly retarded, and most of the algebra development happened in the Muslim world, which hadn't adopted the idea of voids and no voids. Over time, the concept of 0 appears in European mathematics without any real change in canon law. And in the 21st century, we recycle the ether theory by saying that ether looks a lot like dark matter. Ether, by the way, if you recall, is the filling of all spaces with ether, and you couldn't see it. And that pretty much exactly defines what scientists now call as dark matter, and they're going to keep 0. So even our science changes, and changes significantly. Now, the same is true of electricity. In the United States in the early 1800s, or the late 1800s, sorry, we had competition for electricity. There are some old houses in the major cities where you can find 4 different electrical intakes, and there was honest-to-God competition between the electric utility companies. Then in the early 1900s, Sam Insull convinced state regulators that they should give out franchise monopolies, and the utilities should operate under cost of service regulation. The main model, or the main driver for the utility, was capital investment. They often didn't care about efficient costs and saving money. Their job was to convince the state regulators to invest more money, or to allow them to invest more money. Now, this model worked fairly well for about 70 years, principally because the United States grew its electricity consumption by 5 or 7% every year, and it was almost a certainty. In the late 90s, the growth of electricity started to break down in its predictability, and we built a lot of excess capacity. And the market was significantly oversupplied, and some state commissions were thinking of doing prudence hearings to consider whether to allow utilities to recover their costs. That led to a concept which is now fairly well adopted all over the world, called open access. The reason why we call it open access is because up until that time, vertically integrated utilities stated very clearly that they were not opposed to open access. They simply wanted to negotiate the contract for open access. The only problem was that hardly ever happened. The negotiations always broke down. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission required open access, but actually, I believe more importantly, they encouraged the formation of ISOs, which is short for independent system operators. That model has been very successful. Now we face the challenges of even newer technology and probably more importantly, climate change. Now, I don't have enough time to cover all of the details of the transition, but this was a significant transition. In essence, it transitioned to U.S. markets from essentially vertically integrated franchise cost of service regulation to competitive markets. And the most important new development was the independent system operator. The independent system operator in the United States owns no physical assets. It simply operates markets. And in the United States, they operate essentially 4 markets: a dispatch market, which clears every 5 minutes; a day-ahead market for efficient unit scheduling that runs for 24 hours and has hourly dispatch; generation capacity markets, which are annual; and transmission rights markets, which allow you to hedge congestion on the system. Most importantly, all of these markets are based on locational marginal pricing, which is a very important concept in terms of getting the location of the price and the time of the price correctly. If you don't break your prices down by location and time, the market will collapse on you, and it has. One of the biggest lessons we have from the development of ISOs is that you absolutely need prices that are based on specific times and specific places. The ISOs have also taken over the role of planning and investment for the transmission grid and for a certain generation to be connected to the market. All of these models, by the way, have significant approximations, and the approximations essentially are due to the fact that we have software limitation. For example, the American system is an AC system, but almost all of these models are DC models with AC feasibility tests. Oops, wrong way. Now, the new technologies and the new markets that we're encountering are penetration of wind, solar, and batteries. For example, in California, they decided that they needed lots of wind, so they mandated their utilities buy wind. Then they decided maybe they should have a lot of solar, so they mandated their utilities buy a lot of solar. And then they looked around and realized that their prices were going in directions that no one had significantly anticipated, so they ordered their utilities to buy lots of batteries. The one thing that these 3 technologies had in common was that they were all uneconomic except for the subsidies that were granted by the state of California. And also, since we are way behind in getting enough battery storage to balance the market, there was a need for flexible generators. That is, generators that could move through a large range of dispatch in a very short amount of time. Another issue that has come up when these prices vary so significantly is topology optimization, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. But probably the most important ingredient in these markets that has not been fully utilized is what I call price-responsive demand. And I separate that from demand response or demand side management, because that's often the government or the local utility intervening in the market to subsidize certain technologies, which turn out for the most part to be the wrong technologies because they have very bad insight. And it's now very unclear where the peak is. Planning used to be a very easy subject relative to today's business. You'd sort of find the system peak, which you could pretty much identify year in and year out, and then you design a system to operate at that peak. Nowadays, that peak could come at night. For example, if you have a high wind and solar system and the wind is blowing and the sun is out, you could even experience negative prices. That is to say, you'll have too much generation. That used to be the time when there was a system peak. And so the system peak is moving very quickly. And the idea of being able to design the system for a very specific peak is now essentially antiquated. And so there's a huge need for both flexibility and the ability to not try to anticipate where the market is going to be in a day, a week, or several years, and certainly not 10 years. The other thing we've learned is in these systems with high renewable penetration, the first contingency is no longer the largest generator on the system or the largest two generators on the system. It is the weather. If you misestimate the weather, and by weather I mean the temperature, the humidity, the wind velocity, the intensity of the sun, you can very easily create a huge contingency on the system. And a lot of issues that were formerly almost taken for granted, that is the prediction of the next day's consumption by virtue of what the temperature prediction was going to be, is no longer a very good estimate of where the system peak is going to be. Now, as I said before, probably the most important ingredient that we are lacking in these models today, for a lot of different reasons that I won't go into, is what I call price-responsive demand. So what we can see sometimes in these markets is that the wholesale price will be over $1,000, and the price that consumers will be seeing will be under $100 a megawatt hour. Now, that's a huge mismatch, and if the consumers were seeing the real price of generation of electricity, we have seen in experiments that they take action. They move their demand off the peak, they just lower their demand, or they actually buy devices that can take care of those prices, if you show them the price. If you don't show them the price, usually they don't care what the wholesale price is. If they were to respond to the wholesale price, it would be for some social good, and very few electricity consumers actually do that. On the other hand, we can find that consumers may be paying $100 a megawatt hour when the price is minus 50. Now, if you have an electric car, one of the things you would love to do is be paid to charge your battery. Well, when the prices are minus $50, that's exactly what the market should be doing. They should be paying you to consume electric power and charge your your automobile. The interesting thing about electric cars is the easy thing to do is to walk in is to come home from work around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, for some people who come home between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, plug the electric car in and go upstairs and forget it. If you were to see real-time pricing in most of these markets, the difference between coming home and plugging your car in and coming home and plugging your car in 2 or 3 or 4 hours later may be an order of magnitude in prices. And as I said, sometimes maybe negative prices, but today most electric consumers don't see those prices. They don't particularly care, and they don't really react to the fact that the wholesale prices are a lot different from retail prices. Hopefully, and of course, we have the smart appliances. Today, the technology exists so that every refrigerator in the country can be part of primary demand response. A refrigerator simply has a chip. It detects the frequency. If the frequency is high, it can consume, can make some ice, defrost. If the frequency is low, it can do the opposite. Now, one of the big questions is, if you have 50 or 60 million of these devices in the system, can you actually control them? It's an open-ended question. And so probably the most important thing is to get the demand side of the market into the market. And by that I mean having a large portion of the market actually bid in, the demand side market. And that essentially changes the paradigm of generators being your N-1 and N-2 contingencies. Today, my reliability group at the Regulatory Commission tells me that most of the primary frequency response due to a disruption in the system is now coming from demand. It's no longer coming from generation. And that's not even with controls on the system. Now, what's the biggest problem with putting demand in the market? The market software grows immensely. Generators, you can count generators in the tens of thousands in the United States. You count consumers in the hundreds of millions. And so consequently, to get those models to work correctly, you need lots of very good aggregation methodologies to get them to solve. The other issue that's in its initial development in the United States is distribution system optimization. A lot of people are talking about it. It turns out that it's very expensive because you need a lot of technology. And the most important technology is the fact that you need smart meters so that you can see consumption on at least an hourly basis. And you should then, once that happens, bill the customers on an hourly basis. They may not respond at first, but believe me, they will eventually get around to responding anyhow. And not only that, some people worry about those prices, but the bottom line is those prices eventually show up in the consumer's bills anyhow. You get average pricing, but you don't see the actual prices. So that they're going to show up in the consumer's bills. What the only difference is going to be is that the customers are going to have a chance to respond to those bills for the benefit of the market and the society in general. Now, in distribution systems, losses can be quite high. Now, nobody that I know of is actually going to change the model of pricing immediately. So you walk up and tell a customer that, gee, you're at the end of a distribution line, so we're going to, due to the losses on the system, we're going to increase your prices 30%. That's probably not socially doable, or politically doable. But you can influence the location, you can influence the location of new batteries, new renewable facilities, and when you lower the losses at the end of the line by lowering consumption, you benefit everybody on that feeder system. So there's a lot of potential in the distribution system, but the potential probably rest considerably on getting price-responsive demand, because curtailing solar and curtailing wind and curtailing other renewables is probably not the best strategy. Now, to be more specific, about 15 years ago, we started a research project at FERC called optimal transmission switching. It came about because almost all of the simple three-node examples that you see in the textbooks, you can take a line out and improve the efficiency of the market. Well, that was an interesting proposition when I asked one of the authors of that three-node example what would happen if you took one of the lines out, and they said, you can't take the line out. I said, well, you take it out for maintenance, don't you? So we embarked on a project to go through the standard set of test problems, and we started out with the 118 bus model and went through the model. Now, the optimal switching model is a very complicated mathematical model, and we had to work a lot of time, spend a lot of time on getting the optimization to actually work. But once we got it to work, we found out that just by changing the topology in that test system, we could save 25% of the generation costs. And then we worked on other models, New England's 5,000 bus model, the N-1 contingency models, and we continued to find savings. And eventually ARPA-E, our Advanced Projects Office, funded 2 studies, and they actually got the software optimization. Well, it was no longer optimization. It turns out to be too hard to do optimization, but if you just do beneficial transmission switching, that helps. And it turns out that we can now incorporate these in the dispatch models, the 5-minute and the hourly dispatch models, in ways that are timely, and we can save significant amounts of money. And when we tested it on the PJM system, we found out that it saved about $250 million a year. And this isn't even optimization. This is just taking quick hits, essentially, and finding beneficial lines to switch. We don't even know what the optimization is. The same is true for topology switching post contingencies. We found that by looking at the switching options post-contingency, you could also save about $100 million a year. Now, it turns out that that model, the general model for that, can be applied up and down the system. I just talked about corrective switching, which has to take place immediately after a contingency, but also your topology estimator can benefit from these models. Your real-time market, your day-ahead market. Maintenance schedule is nothing more than switching lines in and out of the system when you need to do maintenance. And if you think about optimal transmission planning, it's nothing more than switching lines into the system. And the question becomes, what's the optimal set? This problem up until now has been way too hard to solve, but it turns out it's a very important part, of these new markets. Whoops. Stochastic issues. I'm going to avoid most of the issues and stochastic issues that have turned up because of renewables, but it's interesting that in the old forecasting model, we forecast a very simple outage model for generation, whether you're forced out or actually on, using temperature forecast, using GDP forecast to forecast peak load, and then deciding how much generators you wanted for peak load. Now, we're more interested in ramp rates, overall weather forecasts, temperature forecasts, wind forecasts, cloud cover. When you start to look at those models, they become mind-boggling and very difficult to solve. Whoops. Now, what do we need, just to summarize, in future power markets? You need price-responsive demand. Very important for the demand side. Maybe you don't get it for the residential customer immediately, but the industrial customer should be on that system. Now, the bonus for being a price-responsive demand customer is you don't have to pay for capacity. If you are price-responsive, you are your own capacity backup. That is to say that if the system is in trouble, demand response backs you off the system, not in a forceful way, but in a way you asked to be backed down. We need better software. With all of this equipment, you need much better software and real-time prices. Probably you need reactive power approximations to be much better. They're virtually non-existent now in a lot of these power markets. And hopefully introducing more AC power flow models rather than DC power flow models, and incorporating the distribution systems. The distribution systems, and as you've heard in many of the speakers before, sell power based on a volumetric basis. The distribution systems are, as one of the previous speakers said, are your option system. In other words, you now have the option to buy power off the grid. The grid is designed to supply your maximum amount of need, and so consequently, making that a volumetric number distorts the entire process. And that's why there's a big argument about what solar should be bought back at in the markets. It's because there's too much of the fixed capital costs, the option cost of the system, factored into the volumetric price, and therefore the price signal gets distorted. The problem in the United States is that these markets have been so politicized that it's very hard to unravel the true economic tariff to make the system work a lot better and to get the price responsive issues that you want. As a matter of fact, solar has now become a right-wing political issue in the United States because it's considered a homeowner's right to put solar not only on its roof, but back into the grid. 5 years ago, this was a liberal issue about climate change. Now it becomes a conservative issue about your constitutional rights to put solar power on your rooftop. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening to me, and I'd be glad to answer questions.
Thank you, Neil. A couple of questions.
Hi. So,
Roll?
yes. You talk from a FERC perspective, which is national. A lot of regulation of electricity is state, PUCs, PSCs in the United States, and in India, state electricity regulatory commissions instead of the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. Can you talk a bit about center-state issues? And in India, you've got the additional challenge that to some people, they believe the states don't have the capacity to manage this transition, compared to even the center, which is doing a much better job.
The state-federal issue has been a contentious issue in the United States for quite some time. The issue of, for example, the federal government does not have an overall response to climate change and electricity that is market sensitive. And so consequently, a lot of states have essentially designed their own programs, but some states basically have no program whatsoever. And so some states want to subsidize renewables into the market. If you subsidize renewables into the market, you're going to depress the price because the renewables have very low variable cost. They happen to be intermittent, but they have very high capital costs. And so you immediately start to subsidize the price, and in some parts of the markets, the price goes down. The existing generation, the fossil and the nuclear, start to lose money because of these subsidies. That's become a problem. It's not true in all the states. The Clean Power Program was just suspended by the Supreme Court, and so consequently, a lot of these rules put states and the federal government at odds with each other. And a lot of the states use the electric system to manage a lot of other welfare issues that they have. And to a certain extent, that makes the efficiency of the wholesale market a lot lower. We have an interesting experiment in the United States. We have ERCOT has a single regulator. It basically, for reasons I won't go into, is not regulated by FERC, but so the State Regulatory Commission regulates both its wholesale markets and its retail markets. The market design is a lot similar to most of our ISOs, which are in federal state jurisdiction. And interestingly enough, the ERCOT system is evolving differently, and so we'll see how those issues work out.
Thank you very much, Dick. Pleased to see you. I'm Masood Amin, Chairman, Professor, and Director at University of Minnesota, and Chairman of IEEE Smart Grid. As Chairman of the Texas Reliability Entity Oversight over ERCOT, I can tell you that it's working, and we are grateful. But also the capacity
Grateful
market.
for FERC not being involved?
Yeah, no, but the concern is the capacity market. How much do we need to meet exactly what you mentioned, the changes in weather pattern, weather prediction. The question I have is, has anyone done a total pricing from source to the end use of all fuel sources, fossil fuels, nuclear, renewables? The total accumulated cost, including subsidies, was to really do pricing correctly. We got to know the true cost of all of these different sources.
At FERC, we haven't done this. My guess is that somebody has, but I can't identify the exact entity that has done this. Our philosophy at FERC is to let the markets to second guess. The philosophy is if you get the prices right, and by the way, you shouldn't separate the economics from reliability. Reliability models have traditionally evolved without prices. But if you look carefully, you can back calculate what the price of, what the implicit price of, for example, the 1 in 10 criteria that we use for generation. And it turns out, depending on what model you use and what the assumptions are, to be somewhere between $4,000 and $10,000 a megawatt hour. At $4,000 and $10,000 a megawatt hour, a lot of people would prefer to be price-responsive demand to be their own reliability. I mean, if you're price-responsive demand, you voluntarily leave the grid, which makes it more reliable, and you don't have to pay capacity prices. Sorry, I avoided your question, but it's the honest truth. We actually try to stay out of the calculation of what is the economic generation and what is the economic issue in terms of demand response and things like that. We believe that the best way to do this is through pricing mechanisms in the day-ahead and real-time market. That may, and it scares people. If you come from a planning background, you want to lock in everything for the next 20 years. That's just not the way the Commission thinks anymore, and it so far has worked.
I have one last question. Naive and simple. What does PJM stand for? You used it a couple of times in your slides.
What does it stand for?
PJM, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a very familiar term. It stands for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, who formed this power pool, I think in the 1920s. It was a very loose power pool, very loose cooperation. It has voluntarily, without any federal intervention, it has voluntarily grown to include Delaware, Virginia, Ohio, parts of Illinois, and it was not a forcing of FERC. It was entities seeing that there were economic benefits to belonging to a power pool There's a beautiful example of the integration of AEP and the integration of Dominion Electric into the PJM market, where immediately they started, and literally immediately, because it was a flip of a switch, started to get economic benefits by joining, because the model of the transmission model outside the ISO just simply doesn't work. It ignores loop flows. Basically, it's a scheduling protocol that needs an unscheduling protocol because it doesn't honor the physics of the system.
Thank you, Dr. Neil. Such a marvelous on the policy and also the regulatory requirements, where he has given the innovation, what is that is happening in the regulatory region. I have a question to you. In most of the regulatory work, the percentage of work in terms of the tariff fixation and also the regulatory compliance and also the technical work, I find that in most of the countries, the workload may be 60 to 70% tariff fixation job and maybe 30% technical. I would like to hear from you at FERC, what is the percentage load of the tariff work and also the technical work?
Well, and this is by the way, if you saw the opening slide, there's a disclaimer that says that my views are not necessarily those of the commission or any commissioners, and that's true. I don't speak for them in their thoughts and actions, but we mostly believe that reliability and economics go hand in hand with each other, and that you need any of the market models to mimic the physics of the system, and you can't analyze the physics of the system with lawyers, which we have lots of, and you need the electrical engineers to be part of the entire tariff operation, because without them, you just have markets that have very little relation to the actual physics. Now, I don't want to speak ill of European markets, but when they first got started, the day-ahead markets would operate, everybody would be scheduled, they send the schedule to the system operator, and then the system operator would cancel half of the transactions. I'm probably overstating that. So what does the market mean when half the transactions are canceled? The philosophy that we have is that the engineers have got to be part of this model so that when you schedule and dispatch the system, it honors the physics of the system. The markets just simply don't work otherwise, in our opinion.
Thank you. I request Captain to honor the keynote speaker.